The 1920s was a decade of great change. There were many events, cultural changes, and obstacles, most significantly the Great Depression, that affected all of America. Most importantly, workers, urban business owners and rural farmers, women, and African Americans. These events and changes in the United States during this time period prompted President Roosevelt to take action and implement specific plans when he took over office in 1933. The New Deal was created by FDR and his advisors, and they were policies that they designed to address the problems that had stemmed from the Great Depression. These policies focused on relief, recovery, and reform. Out of these, I would say that the theme of reform would be consistent to describe both events in the 1920s and FDR's New Deal. This is because every person that was involved in America at this time, I believe, was essentially reformed, including, the business owners, the farmers, the women. Everyone was changed. The American culture had been changed by mass communication and mass consumption. The African American culture had changed with the Harlem Renaissance. And so I just feel like everything had been reformed. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, and this sent Wall Street into a panic. The Great Depression began soon after. When President Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, America was in the midst of the worst economic crisis in its history. In some cities, the jobless rate was 40%. In Detroit, it was 50%. People were caught in a web of despair. FDR's response to this unprecedented crisis was to initiate the New Deal. The New Deal was orchestrated by a core group of advisors known as the Brains Trust, who helped President Roosevelt enact 15 major laws. One significant one was the Banking Act, which finally brought an end to the panic that gripped the nation's banking system. The success of this depended in large measure on the willingness of the American people to once again place their faith and money in the local banks. The Great Depression did not only affect business owners and the men of Wall Street, it also affected rural workers, which were the farmers. In rural America, thousands of tons of unmarketable crops sat rotting in storage bins, while farm income plummeted and thousands of families were forced to abandon their homes. In the Farming with Oxen manuscript, Oxen says, quote, "In 1931, like many other tenant farmers, I was heavily in debt, with my mules and most of my farm implements mortgaged," unquote. President Roosevelt and his administration focused on aiding farmers through the Agricultural Adjustment Act and creating more jobs through programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps. In addition, Americans received more direct relief from the federal government in the form of public assistance and housing aid. In the letter to Mr. McRae, Judge Hughes says, quote, "Many farmers tell me that all they ask is that the government will let them alone. On the other hand, there are many more who are in dire need, and not knowing which way to turn, they turn desperately to the government." Unquote. Fortunately for those seeking government assistance, these new programs helped a lot. In the interview with Alice Fairweather, a squatter farmer, she says, quote, "I think we got a great president way up there in Washington now. The best we ever had that I know of. He really seems to care about the real poor folks like us." Unquote. Many farmers like Alice looked to FDR for hope and recognized that this was the first time in history where a president sought to help every person, regardless of where they lived, their job, or their income. Though the New Deal did not completely restore the nation to full employment, it lessened the worst effects of the Great Depression and offered hope and restored the faith of the American people in the government. It also established federal programs like Social Security that are still instrumental to this day. In this picture, the man holds a sign that says, "We want to be citizens, not transients." This means that they wanted steady jobs. They wanted stability. These people were tired of being jobless and moving from job to job. They were tired of an unsteady life and unsteady income and were forced to look to President Roosevelt to help fix their problems. In the interview with an Italian worker, he says, quote, "Roosevelt is a damn good man. You take all these young fellows and you can't talk to them like in the old days to swing them over. Today, all these kids are satisfied on WPA and the NYA." After the passage of the 19th Amendment, American women voted in a presidential election for the first time in 1920. After more than 23,000 women entered the workforce during World War I, the traditional role of women in society was challenged. American women started to enjoy education and occupational opportunities in the 1920s and pushed for more freedom and independence. This led to women becoming modern and rebellious for the first time. Modern women of the 1920s rejected the modest fashions and ideas of their grandmothers and mothers. These rebellious young women wore short dresses, cut their hair short, smoked and danced in nightclubs, and were referred to as flappers. This modern woman, aka flapper movement, ties into the New Deal because the principal advocate for women's economic and social rights within the context of the New Deal was Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Roosevelt. She would get thousands of letters from ordinary Americans and saw that women, especially working women, were suffering as a consequence of the Great Depression. From the start of her husband's administration, she lobbied those in charge of the federal employment relief programs to make sure that opportunities for work were made available to women. Her husband's relief czar, Harry Hopkins, not only agreed to create a special women's division within the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, but also to appoint a woman to head it. The employment benefits extended to women improved dramatically with the establishment of the Works Progress Administration. Women also benefited from the major reforms of the New Deal, such as the Fair Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. These New Deal reliefs established the precedent that the plight of working women must be taken into consideration in any state or national effort to provide relief to the unemployed. The opportunities provided by the New Deal for professional women was unprecedented. Between the end of World War I and the middle of the 1930s, there was a cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem named the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem experienced a flowering of black culture with newspapers, magazines, theater groups, and jazz. In New York City, the black population doubled. In the 1920s, many women formed together to form the Anti-Lynching Crusaders. Their slogan was, "A million women united to stop lynching." They were trying to raise at least $1 from every woman united with them and to finish this work on or before January 1st, 1923. This is an example of women getting more power and African Americans getting more power. African Americans did benefit from the New Deal. One of the benefits that they had was the Federal Music Project, which funded performances of black composers. They also benefited from the New Deal's educational programs, which taught over 1 million illiterate blacks to read and write. With respect to employment, the Works Progress Administration employed approximately 350,000 African Americans annually. Though the New Deal did not bring an end to the tremendous injustices that African Americans had to suffer on a day-to-day basis, the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt gave the African American community hope. This was the first time in their history where they felt that they could voice their grievances and opinions to the government and they could expect sympathy and action back. FDR was the first president to appoint an African American as a federal judge, and he was the first president to publicly call lynching murder. He tripled the number of African Americans working for the federal government, and he made it clear that the federal government had a responsibility to ensure the civil rights of all Americans were protected. In the 1920s, there was a new emphasis on consumer consumption, and it was promoted through a new mass culture. Radios, movies, mass circulation magazines became popular, and advertising and mass consumer culture brought about a shift in values. There was a greater emphasis on personal pleasure, leisurely activities, and entertainment. By the end of the 1920s, the nation had 23,000 theaters. Movies fed materialism and encouraged an emphasis on leisure and recreation. President Roosevelt used this new emphasis on consumption to his benefit. He was a very effective communicator and used the power of radio to communicate his goals and vision to the nation through weekly radio addresses known as fireside chats. This was one of the most influential parts of the New Deal because it restored the confidence of a deeply discouraged population. People would sit around with their family and friends and listen to his fireside chats. And so it did restore the spirit of the nation as he worked to lift the economy out of the Great Depression.